Hello, this is Just Listen, hosted by George. Today is March 16th, 2026. I hope that everyone had a great weekend since it was a little bit of a holiday. Today, I want to talk about U.S. federal government policy on the Middle East. I want to bring some ideas together and be concise because if you watch the mainstream media with the sound bites, maybe you'll be confused. So, what is our policy in the Middle East currently? So, as you know, the president is the commander in chief according to the Constitution, which means that he or she can act in the best interest of the country as far as conflicts go, etc. Now, what is Congress's role? So I had to go and look it up in the Constitution because when I'm doing research for these podcasts, I'm finding more and more, and I mentioned this before, that there's personal opinion in there with facts. So I have to take the additional time to look at multiple sources to make sure that I'm getting the true language. And in the Constitution part, I have to go and look at the actual Constitution and then take out the garbage. Okay, so Congress holds the primary authority for initiating and sustaining war. And initiating in this case means once Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate says, yeah, they did this to us, so now we are declaring war. Last time we did that was actually World War II. And we also briefly, Congress concurred with the first Iraq war. So those were the only two times recently that Congress got involved because the first Bush wanted concurrence from the Congress, so he got that. That's based on the personal style of the president at the time, and we had just been out of Vietnam for probably a decade and a half, something like that. So that was the thinking then. But the commander in chief is president for conflicts, wars, and all that, which means that in that office they can initiate the action. All right. So for Congress, the core constitutional powers under Article 1, Section 8, granted the explicit powers related to conflicts, but that's the power of the purse. Congress has the sole power to formally declare war. We talked about that a second ago. It's gotten complicated, and you know the facts and details on that, but this is what the Constitution says. And under Article 1, Section 8, it's the power of the purse. So, responsible for raising and supporting armies and providing for a navy, it controls military funding through appropriations. Now, the last part of what I said was the additional language put out there by whoever initiated this article from my research. So, yes, Congress funds everything for the country to include military funding. And that also means, so every year, as you are aware, the military gets appropriations. And so when there are conflicts, and I'm looking at our past record, they can fund the Pentagon and the military for additional funding. Now, that's different from them giving money to countries like we were doing in the past. So that's the blur there. So you have to decide if, when we're giving countries money to wage war, how we feel about that for our own budgets. Okay, so the necessary and proper clause is the next one. It allows Congress to make all laws needed to carry out its war-making powers, including the authority to pass legislation like the War Powers Act. Now, the last part again was thrown in there because during the Vietnam War, which in some parts of the country were very unpopular, they used that to get President Nixon to end the war. So the press is almost like another part of government that can influence the Congress and the president to do stuff. And there's also the oversight and statutes, wartime oversight and statutes. So the modern take on that is, and the reason I mention it is that people in Congress, not all of them, they get committee appointments and stuff like that. They get briefed on things going on in hotspots. I'll just call them hotspots. So someone in Congress knows what's going on. Now, do they tell the other members of Congress? That's not clear. I've never heard anyone talk about that. But that lays out the federal government policy, and in this case, on the Middle East. And I gave you a little bit of background just to set the table for what's coming up next. So here is what the administration, and I would submit to you that Congress is involved in the thinking process. They were involved the whole time. So we're talking about Iran specifically because this is a good example. So the first thing that is being done is they're putting maximum pressure on Iran. Now, Congress has characterized it as a war. I think the president was leaning more towards conflict. So if you go and look that up, you get varying degrees of what that means. So I won't bore you with that. But under the current policy, transition, so they want to transition from economic pressure to direct military action in the region against Iran. The reason I say that like that is because they're doing other things that I'm going to bring to your attention. So, of course, we know about the military strikes, and we also know that the United States, wants to get rid of Iran's nuclear sites and the military infrastructure. Okay, so that is the stated purpose of the conflict. So now it's being described, because we're talking about the war status. So you can watch 6 different mainstream media shows, and the characterization is totally different, as you well know, and you don't have time to go and watch 6 different programs to figure things out. And our assumption is that it's facts in detail. Well, that's why I have this podcast to explain what is actually happening based on the facts. So we also are entering into the policy being maritime security. I told you previously that that was an agreement that was done in 2025. So I called that before even the mainstream media started talking about it. Their spin on it was a little bit different, but as of today, the U.S. Navy can escort tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. And what's prompting it is that oil prices are going up. Well, I previously told you that we have less than 10% of crude oil coming from the Middle East. We are locked into those global markets, and people called speculators that are on Wall Street, if they get spooked, the price will go up. So, just a basic fact here. So, how is it that when something starts, the price immediately goes up, but then after the action is complete, we'll call it a conflict again, it takes months for the price to go down? And most of us are reasonable voters, so the comparison, the price should change almost immediately in the modern world, meaning, hey, okay, well, the price has gone down, so prices should go down just as fast. So it's hard to not assert that someone is making money off of it. That's the bottom line. So that is the policy. And also, to add to that, we in the Middle East, the United States has something called a strategic realignment with Syria. The Syrian government, under the old government, they were taken out of power. And as a matter of fact, that previous leader, I think, is living in France. So we are giving sanctions relief to Syria, and we lifted the major sanctions against them. And in Syria, we had sanctions against them for at least 2 decades. And now there's diplomatic normalization going on that probably you didn't even know was happening. And they're still trying to get ISIS out of Syria. So that's the Middle East policy that the United States is doing. And it's important because if you put all of these details together, maybe you have a different opinion as a voter to what the big goal is. Now, and as you know, the last thing was the Israeli Palestinian in Gaza. There is actually agreement between them. So we're giving billions of dollars in military assistance, including a proposed $6 billion supplemental. And the actual ceasefire, the administration brokered a 20-point Gaza ceasefire plan in October 2025. And then we have the Palestinian relations. All right, so the U.S. has largely isolated the Palestinian Authority, revoking visas for its delegation and rejecting UN resolutions for a Palestinian state. Now, this is the most important thing for American policy. So if the Palestinians would get statehood, that means that they have access to getting better weapons. They could actually want to get nuclear weapons, all of that stuff. So I would assert that that's why they're trying to block them from getting statehood. That was the original issue in the first place. And then, of course, they want to stabilize the area and troop movements. So since 2003, in 2025, there's been the largest regional military mobilization, and then we're drawn down in Iraq and Yemen operations, military campaigns against the Houthis in 2025. And during the conflict, I want to note that Americans are being pulled out of the region of Iran. Now, what you probably didn't know is that the State Department actually has a plan, and they designate them as safe havens within the region, or to use specific land and air corridors to reach third countries where commercial travel remains available. So the places are in Egypt, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia and Turkey. So the mainstream media might say one thing, but there is a plan in place that's been in place for probably 20 years that gets people out as soon as they can. And the overall big picture of the Middle East policy is that I have described the roles of each party without getting into the weeds with I've gotten into the weeds of who is responsible for what, and I would tell you to check multiple sources. But before we jump to conclusions about, it's not just Iran that we're looking at. We're looking at the whole Middle East and how to stabilize that. So let me know what you think. And if you can, share it with someone else so that they can subscribe. This is Just Listen, hosted by George. Have a great day.